After the Second World War, the focus of art and culture shifted from Paris to New York City, and that the abstract expressionists then are the group that begin to arise out of that post-war period. Despite the devastation in Europe and the destruction and all of the things that happened as a result of the Second World War, Europe didn't just close up shop. Artists continued to work even under these rather difficult conditions. So that's what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about post-World War II European art. And again, I'm going to stay, for the most part, at least this time around, with painting, because there are some fascinating artists, fascinating ideas. There is this sort of symbiotic relationship between the Americans and the Europeans. We've already talked about the fact that the whole movement of surrealism, more or less, had transplanted itself to New York. So you had that interaction going on in New York. But in Europe, you had a lot of Americans who actually did go to Europe, even though it was a rather sad situation. In fact, that was one of the reasons they went, because it was cheap to live there. And this was especially true about American painters who had been GIs, because they could go to Europe and live on the GI Bill, and they could live very cheaply in Paris. And a lot of American painters fought in the war, and then they ended up staying in Paris. Some, as a matter of fact, became better known in Paris than they did in New York, because they chose to opt out of New York and to stay in Europe. So in any case, we're going to talk about that scene. So here we are back up on the upper level on North Bridge. And when you walk straight through, this painting that's on the back wall is that painting by Jean Dubuffet called Building Facades from 1946. This is a Giacometti sculpture. We'll talk about Giacometti later. Wonderful wall text. So here describes what the situation was in post-war Europe. We could talk about post-war London, post-war Berlin, but most often we start by talking about post-war Paris. And so that gets us to the situation in France after the war. France is in a sad state, Paris specifically. Its economy was devastated by the war. In terms of infrastructure, it was a devastated city. 1/6 of all the buildings in Paris were in a seriously dilapidated state. Even people who were living in those buildings, many of those buildings had been condemned, but the people continued to live in them. There was a kind of shabbiness, a kind of depressing sort of character to Paris immediately after the war. There was great hardship. Here I'm taking you through just where we now place this art. So this is the room when you come in. This is Dubuffet with Giacometti. This is the peeking into the abstract expressionist room, but here are those rooms again. In the past, we never really had a good representation of these artists up and out because we simply didn't have the floor space. So now this is one of the big changes, I think, in the new installation, is that we're giving more prominence to these post-war Europeans. So in April, for example, 1945, the population living in Paris averaged about 1,300 calories a day. Old people were literally starving in Paris. There was a very vital black market. Of course, politics were very incendiary, especially in terms of now either feelings of guilt about how they had how the Nazis had sort of run through and taken Paris, and then also issues about the partisans and who had collaborated. So these were all issues that were being sort of fought over and debated. Bread was rationed in Paris until February 1948. Coffee, cooking oil, sugar, rice were rationed until May of 1949. So it was a difficult period. Here's Dubuffet again. We're going to talk, and this is Morandi here, who we've never had up before, and we'll briefly mention him. So there were political tensions in Paris, and they were related now to both concern about the United States and concern about communism and the Soviet Union. Population of Paris grew by about 50,000 people between 46 and 54. So that added another, to the total, 379,000 residents. 100,000 housing units in the city had been declared unhealthy. As I said, people were still occupying buildings they should not have been. And then the other problem was tuberculosis, which had broken out and was rampant. So for an artist, for anybody, it was a difficult period. For artists, of course, it would be particularly difficult in some practical ways. First of all, getting materials. You're not going to go down to your local paint store because they didn't exist anymore. They were all pretty well gone. So you had to start thinking about how I could make art out of things that I could pull out of the rubble, or just sort of rethink my processes and materials. And that is fundamental to understanding Dubuffet. So there's a photograph of Jean Dubuffet from 1956. And one of the great Dubuffets we have, as I mentioned already, Building Facades from 46. Dubuffet is the sort of creator, founder, inspiration behind a movement that we call Art Brut, B-R-U-T, which can translate in different ways from the French, but probably raw art is maybe the best translation. And what it related to was Dubuffet's belief that after this destruction of the war and after sort of Western culture had gone through this conflagration, that he wanted to return to something that was simple, if not even naive, that spoke to a more direct kind of non-academic, non-sophisticated tradition of art making. So he was against what he did refer to as cultural art, and Art Brut was supposed to be the opposite of that. So something we've mentioned already with somebody like Paul Klee and others, Dubuffet believed that we should look at the art of children because of the sort of their innocence. We should look at non-Western traditions of art making. We should look at the art being made by people in asylums, etc. People who had no formal training, they'd never gone to the academy. Now today, that concept can go under like 12 different titles. So sometimes it's called naive art, sometimes it's called outsider art, sometimes it's called primitive art, sometimes it's called graffiti art, sometimes it's called folk art, sometimes it's called visionary art. And most recently here at the National Gallery, it was called outlier art, because we just did a huge exhibition on a number of these kinds of self-taught artists. All those terms have a certain validity, if not capturing the idea in its entirety. Dubuffet started collecting things like this, anything that he would see, and he put together an incredibly large collection of what came to be known as the collection of Art Brut, and he founded an organization, a kind of collection organization in 1948 that was a kind of I don't want to call it a think tank, but it was dedicated to studying this kind of art, to promoting this kind of art. And then the museum was ultimately built, and that was in the city of Lucerne in Switzerland. So what is it about Dubuffet? What is he trying to do? So when you look at a building, when you look at a painting like this, Building Facades, obviously it has a great naivete, it has a great childlike quality. All of the principles of sophisticated perspective and drawing and all of that are totally abandoned here. But even beyond that, what he begins to do, although not in this picture, is he begins to put into his mixtures of paint whatever he can scrounge up. So very often he'll have oil paint with sand and broken glass and little pebbles, things that he's just sort of gone around and scrounged from what he could find, and then somehow turned it into a material. Sometimes it's a thick, almost like a paste. And so he will work flat on a table, and he'll kind of trowel this stuff on. And it comes out to be very thick, and then he can score through it and work through it with all kinds of implements like spoons and knives and palette knives, sticks. He doesn't use just traditional this is not the time for a sable hair brush, let's put it that way, because this stuff is pretty dense very often. There's a lot of humor in Dubuffet, despite the period and despite the devastation. This childlike quality, little guys peeking out of the windows and everything. I mean, it's childlike in a very innocent and very often very enjoyable, positive kind of way. During the war, he was assigned to the meteorological division of the army, and they posted him to the top of the Eiffel Tower. And so one of the things you see in him very often, he would constantly obviously be looking down at all these little people walking around. And so that sort of came into his language as well. These are good examples of the thickness now. This work on the left is called The Darner of Socks. She's fixing a sock here, sewing a sock, from 1945. This is oil and pebbles on canvas. Sometimes he'll grind up the pebbles. Sometimes if they're small enough, they'll just be there. And the one on the right is called Berthollet as a Blossoming Bouquet Sideshow Portrait. So the titles are very humorous, often. This has oil, plaster, pebbles, and sand, this work on the right. So by the time he trowels all this stuff on, he's got to really start digging through it almost. And in fact, he liked that idea because he thought that idea was related to archaeology, that he was kind of digging through layers of material to reveal a form the way that an archaeologist might discover something that's embedded in the soil. He's fascinated with I don't know how else to say it, dirt. He's fascinated with soil, dirt, any kind of detritus markings on walls, things that have been ripped off walls, posters, and they just leave behind a little remnant, all of this kind of stuff. What's wonderful about works like this is when he does a portrait, because they look like this, but they look exactly like the person. Somehow, even though they're so distorted and they're so naive and childlike, he captures the essence of the person that he's actually portraying. This is a marbleized body of a lady. There's her head. And here are her arms. Rather broad hips, etc. From 1950, this has oil and sand on canvas. This is a great title. It's called Combat Beard, from 1959. This is the beard here. There's the face up there. Notice this kind of treatment here. And a lot of that is coming from, he would walk through Paris and just look at walls. You know, he would just look at a wall. And if it had a stain on it, or it was kind of scraped, or it had been, certainly during the war, it had been battered, it had been shot at, who knows what, he would remember those. He used to actually do tracings from walls, and then sort of look at those and bring some of those surfaces back into his process here. This is process oriented. So in keeping with what the New York School artists were doing, again, a big part of what Dubuffet is doing is about the process. And not always does he know or can he control what the end result will be. When you start mixing all this stuff together, you're never quite sure. Maybe it's drying too quickly, maybe it's too thick, maybe it doesn't hold to the surface, maybe it starts separating or peeling one thing from another thing. So there is a lot of process. There are the effects of chance, some of the surrealist ideas, and there is a certain automatism as well, where this fascination with surfaces, and very often, and this is going to be important later for an artist we're going to look at named Jean Fautrier, you'll notice this body is, it's thick, but it's also somewhat battered. It seems somewhat rough, somewhat, it's certainly not idealized. And so this idea after the war, especially that the body takes on almost a kind of beaten, distraught, physically attacked kind of surface in this way of dealing with some of the disillusionment about the future, shall we say, in Europe after the war. But Dubuffet explores a lot of different realms. I'm not talking about him as a sculptor today, and we have some beautiful Dubuffet sculptures that come much later in his career. But this is one of the great works. This is called Preserves of Matter and Light, Texturology, number 53, from 1958. This is where he begins to take this material, and it could be various materials. And in this case, it is actually only oil paint with some sand, but it can be other things. And he just does a uniform, flat sort of surface. It's 1958, so remember what's going on in America. Jackson Pollock all over painting, the abstract expressionists. So it has this all over surface. It's flat. It's painted top to bottom, left to right. Obviously, there's no sort of centrality. Very often he has to do this off the easel. He's working on the floor or he's working on a table, so he's working flat. And this really is texturology. This is the term that he uses, texturology, is really related to soil, to dirt. He again, it's this idea of looking closely at something, but then doing a whole expanse of that relates to that sort of specific material. So here is Pollock. This is number 1, 1950, Lavender Mist that we have from 1950, and then Texturology that I just showed you. There is a complicated and interesting connection here, and it relates to a third artist that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm going to mention him because he's part of this sort of trio at the moment. The Phillips collection, in fact, did an exhibition on these three. I don't know, it was many years ago. The other artist is the artist from the Philippines, Alfonso Osorio. Osorio, Pollock, and Dubuffet all knew each other, but they didn't just know each other. They crossed paths a lot at this time. And so this connection is not as far-fetched as you might think. Between 1948 and 1952, these three artists were very close. Osorio was visiting Dubuffet in Paris, so that's the first thing. He knows Dubuffet, he's in Paris, he visits Dubuffet. While he's in Paris, he loans his house, or I shouldn't say he loans his house, he allows Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner to house sit for him. His house is in the West Village. So he's with Dubuffet, the Pollocks are in his house sitting in the West Village. Then Dubuffet leaves Paris and comes to New York with Osorio. They come back together. So he's there in 51, 52. There's a lot of letters that are exchanged. Osorio took care of, he was almost like the guardian or the caretaker of a big chunk of Dubuffet's Art Brut collection. Dubuffet said, I'd like to leave this stuff with you. And so it was housed in Osorio's house. So he had all of this Art Brut, these primitive things and things that came from very primitive sources. And of course, Osorio and Pollock, then they were neighbors. They lived right almost next to each other. So Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner had ample opportunity to look at all this collection because they were both living near each other on Long Island. So a lot of the similar issues that Dubuffet was talking about and Pollock was talking about, all over painting, abstraction, flatness, texture, all these things, these three guys were sort of all together, essentially discussing all of these things. So you might want to look at that. Actually, you might want to look at that catalog if you're interested in this, because it was a very interesting show that the Phillips collection did. I can't remember the year. I mentioned already this idea of materiality, the material, and we see it in Dubuffet. And the artist who owes a lot to Dubuffet is this French artist named Jean Fautrier. So we're looking at two works by Fautrier. On the left, it's called The Forest, the Chestnut from 1943. And on the right, we don't have this painting, but we do own that painting. On the right, called Body and Soul from 1957. One of the things I should just mention now in passing, because I'm going to keep using this term and I should get it out of the way, but in post-war Europe, especially in Paris, but it was basically throughout Europe, there was a kind of a kind of a similar approach to painting that we would call abstract expressionism in the United States. Very gestural, abstract, flatness, all of that. They didn't call it abstract expressionism in Europe. In fact, they use a bunch of different terms, but probably the most all-encompassing term is the French term art informel, what we might say informal art. Art informel. Another term that is often used in place of that is Taschism, Tachisme. Taschism, tash means touch or sort of blot. So you'll hear both of those terms in Europe, Taschism, art informel, and they're essentially the European equivalents to abstract expressionism. But within those movements, again, as with abstract expressionism, there's a lot of variety. So Fautrier is an important practitioner of art informel. He has a very fascinating history. He's rather important. He's born in Paris. He goes off to the war, but he's released from the war because of for health reasons. He had asthma and other afflictions, and he moves to the south of France. He shifts Aix-en-Provence, Marseille, all along the south before he comes back to Paris. He comes back to Paris in January 1943. The war is still going on, obviously, and he's arrested by the Gestapo. When he returns to Paris, he's imprisoned, and eventually he's released, and he leaves Paris for good and settles in a town just outside of Paris, essentially the suburbs of Paris. And the series that he begins at that point is called The Hostages. And it's very comparable to these images. And what it deals with is essentially torture and execution and defilement and degradation of the, that's a lot, of the human body. So that's a carryover here, because as I was mentioning with Dubuffet, with that marbleized woman, what you often see in Fautrier is the sense of flesh that's been torn apart or ripped apart, or it's thickly encrusted, but then it's somehow been tortured or somehow been attacked in a certain way. And that certainly is a reference to this whole imprisonment period. He's all about materials. So like Dubuffet, Fautrier is constantly experimenting with different materials. So here we have combinations of things like oil, varnish, sand, pebbles, dry powder pigment, and then that's all mixed up to then make a kind of a paste that you see here. So Dubuffet, Fautrier are associated certainly with Art Brut, but even more than that, they're what we might call matter painters, matter in the sense of material. They're very focused on materials and on what you might say redeeming materials that have no history of sort of or tradition in the history of art. You know, you can't go back and really look at how Michelangelo painted with pebbles or something like. They're taking materials that have had no connotation of high art culture, and they're sort of redeeming these materials. And this is in the post-war age now. In some ways, what these artists are interested in is going back to some kind of primitive, to think of history now as a tabula rasa. Okay, we got to start over. Now we got to start over. And so we're going to go right back to the simplest materials, the simplest ideas, the most primitive, childlike, naive ways of thinking, because what did the other stuff get us? In some ways, it's like Dada, except Dada is totally nihilistic. You know, but these guys are not nihilistic. They're going to try to get us through this in a certain way. Now, I mentioned to you a while back when we were talking about Modigliani that he's often part of what we call at that period in time, in the period around the First World War, the School of Paris. But then I mentioned to you, if you recall, that there's another School of Paris, and of course this is the School of Paris that takes place after the Second World War. And so there are a number of painters, in this case some are French, but just like the previous School of Paris, a lot of them are emigres. They're not French, they're German or other nationalities, but they settle in Paris. But one of the great French proponents of this sort of school of Paris and a great gestural abstract painter is this guy here on the left, and that's Pierre Soulages. We own, fortunately, both of these Soulages paintings. They're up for a while, they're down now, but they were up for a good length of time. He just he has a very interesting title for his works, and the title is Painting, and then with a date. So here on the left is Painting 1955, and then if he does more than one in the same year, which of course he does, then he gives it a more specific date. So the painting on the right is March 6, 1955, Painting March 6, 1955. Soulages is one of the great painters of the School of Paris after the war. He is certainly sensitive to what was happening in America. Some people liken him to Franz Klein, except there's much more sort of subtlety and light and surface. He was very interested in architecture, very interested in Romanesque architecture. And so this idea of building, construction, post and lintel, all of these ideas are prevalent in him. He talked about the School of Paris and how, in essence, it was hard to codify it. And he said at one point, quote, "The number, the diversity of movements, and the personalities of the creating artists are not a school, but rather a salutary anti-school." So again, they're not nihilistic, and they're not really, a lot of them are different, but they're brought together by the basic ideas of the abstract expressionists as well. Abstraction, flatness for the most part, gestural work, or strong sense of field, color, similar concerns. Soulages is a member of this sort of evident and present as the School of Paris, and another painter is Hans Hartung, the German, here. It's really sad, now I'm going to give an editorial. It's sad that these artists aren't better known in the United States. It's just not, along with the rest of the world, everybody just said, okay, New York, forget Paris, forget everywhere else. And it's really too bad because they're really quite talented artists. We do own this painting, believe it or not. This is the right way. It's a long, narrow painting. I've never seen it out. It's called Composition 1952. So we own this painting. The painting in the center, he does the same thing almost as Soulages. He just gives them sort of catalog type numbers. This is T50 number 8, T50 number 8 from 1950. And that's a photograph of Hans Hartung. He was born in Leipzig in 1904. He's a very intelligent, very well cultivated. He's sort of like Kandinsky in a certain way. He's interested in philosophy and theology and music and astronomy, religion, all of these things. Eventually comes to painting. He certainly has a deep understanding of the art of the past, going back especially to artists who work with dramatic contrast of light and dark, like Rembrandt, Goya. These are two artists that he looks at very closely. And then he's very much influenced by the German expressionists, that generation that we've already spoken about. Kokoschka, Emil Nolde are important to him. What he's most associated with, you can sense here, is graphic kind of notation, almost a sense of writing, but working very quickly in this graphic way. He eliminates almost all figurative elements from his paintings. He's a major part of art informel, as we would say. They're calligraphic. He does move through this calligraphic phase to something that's a little bit heavier. Eventually he starts to, this is interesting because he starts to move to monochromatic paintings. So they're all one field of color. They're sort of a beautiful field. But then he takes an implement that he makes, it's like a comb, and he combs through it. So the notations are not made with a stick or a brush, they're made with this comb. And they're really quite fascinating. So many of these artists do arrive in America, like Ad Reinhardt, and in Europe, they eventually arrive at a total dark field, just one monochromatic sort of color, and they may do something to that, and Hartung is like that. So again, somebody who should be better known. My favorite guy, I guess because he's the most tragic, I love this guy's work, and that's Nicholas de Stael. Here, you can almost sense this guy is going to have a hard life. He was incredibly sensitive, and just a very difficult situation. In any case, he's Russian, but he's part of the school of Paris. He comes to Paris. Almost his entire life, from the time he was a young adult, was spent in France. He's, again, a great student of art history, especially the works of Cézanne, Matisse, George Braque. Braque is particularly important to Nicolas de Staël. During the Second World War, he enlisted in the Foreign Legion. There were a number of French artists who go into the Foreign Legion. They get to wear those nice caps and the whole thing, and poets as well, by the way. You had a whole kind of cultural contingent in the Foreign Legion. So he's in the Foreign Legion. He's demobilized, though, again, in part for health reasons, by 1940. He moves to Nice, southern France, which is really where he'll continue to work. He becomes close to Sonia Delaunay. Remember her, Robert Delaunay, the Orphic cubist that we've talked about. Also Jean Arp, or Hans Arp. They become two of his closer friends. He comes back to Paris for a while and has a studio there, and his studio is within a few blocks of George Braque's studio. So they are very close, spend a lot of time together. What de Staël's work is noted for is this thick, rich, beautiful, mosaic-like encrusted surfaces of these small, well, sometimes they're small, kind of square shapes that he puts together. And we have only one painting by Nicolas de Staël at the National Gallery, but that's okay, because the one patron who he didn't discover, well, I guess he did. In the United States, this would be the guy who really did kind of discover de Staël for an American audience, was Duncan Phillips. So if you go to the Phillips collection, they have a beautiful selection of paintings by Nicolas de Staël. We have one, but they have like 6 or 7, because he was ahead of the curve, Duncan Phillips, on de Staël, and he started to support him and buy his work. So these are 2 Phillips collection works. Composition on the left from 1948, and a painting called North on the right from 1949. These are pretty typical thick encrusted surfaces again, not unlike Dubuffet, but here it's pure paint. There's no detritus or extraneous materials. It's a heavy impasto. It's been applied almost exclusively with a palette knife, and he kind of pushes through it and scrapes through it. He's interested in a lot of different sources: Venetian art, Byzantine art, mosaics. All of that comes through. The story about his relationship to the Phillips collection, there was an American dealer in 1950. His name was Theodore Schempp. And Theodore Schempp had purchased a bunch of de Staël paintings. He didn't really know. He didn't really like him. He didn't dislike him. He didn't like him, but he ended up buying a bunch of paintings. So in 1950, he threw them all in his station wagon, and he drove here to D.C. to meet Duncan Phillips. And he said, this guy's pretty good. Maybe you should think about him. He needs the money. And that's when Duncan Phillips immediately bought 6 paintings. So that began that relationship. These paintings really suffer in reproduction because the surfaces are so thick and beautiful and rich, and the brushwork and the palette knife work. These are both Phillips collection works. On the left is Nocturne from 1950. On the right is the Sceaux Park. It's a park in France, Sceaux Park from 1952. De Staël stays close to nature. So Nocturne Park, he's looking at nature, and he said about that, he said, quote, "We are continuously influenced and penetrated by nature." So he's sensitive to light, he's sensitive to natural forms, to landscape. He admired both Turner and Constable, so you sense that sometimes. But he translates nature into rhythm, color, form, brushwork. It's certainly an abstracted nature. He starts with his own experience, but of course, then he pushes nature, and he strives to sort of synthesize what he sees with a kind of abstract language. So it's not like he's literally trying to transcribe what he sees. He's a wonderful colorist. Towards the end of his life, he goes almost exclusively gray-blue, white, and they're really stunning paintings in that limited chromatic range. Here, a little bit more color. This is the painting we own at the National Gallery, which, no offense, I've never seen hanging. This is called Ballet from 1952. And then this is another Phillips collection work called Fugue from 1951-52. He's very interested in all the arts. So ballet, obviously, he's interested in dance, and then he thinks about rhythms. He's interested in music. So like Kandinsky, and de Stael was very affected by Kandinsky. Kandinsky did paintings called Fugue and Chaconne and all these things where he was trying to duplicate or replicate a particular musical form. Fugue, the repetition of forms, you sort of have the theme and then you repeat the theme. So that sense of repetition, they are almost like notes in that sense on a canvas here. But the surfaces are incredible. They're luscious. And the sense of light, somehow he gets a light to come out of these paintings that looks like it's almost sometimes a backlight, that it's coming from the back to the front of the picture. Now, I always make pilgrimages to see artists where they lived. I'm really into this, sit at cafes where they sat. Not too long ago, I think I mentioned this, I was doing a program for the Smithsonian. We were in the French Riviera, and we went to Antibes to see the Picasso Museum at Antibes. And this is Antibes here. And de Stael moved to Antibes, and he lived there from 1953 until his death on March 16th, 1955. He lived in that house right there. And this is the house today, and this is the plaque telling you that he lived and died there. He took his own life after finishing his greatest, largest painting that's today at the Antibes, is at the Picasso Museum in Antibes. It's called The Grand Concert. I'll show it to you in a second. And he was painting that painting up on the terrace up here, up at the very top, in the open air, even though it's not a landscape or an open air painting. He finished the painting, and then he jumped off the roof and killed himself. So that's the plaque that tells you here now where he lived and died here. What's the painting he completed? It's this great painting today inside the museum. So here's a docent talking to the children about the painting. This is called The Concert from 1955. So it's in this is the Picasso Museum. That's what it is. It's not the de Stael Museum. But in the Picasso Museum at Antibes, there are works by Nicolas de Stael, a very beautiful selection because he's sort of their local painter. So here you can see how he was beginning to flatten and thin out, and these incredible big fields of color again. So much like we see with American painters, these big flat fields of red. Still a sense of the mosaic idea, the piano here, the big bass here. They're really quite stunning. Of course, people speculate. De Stael, at this point in his life, towards the end of his life, felt that he was never going to really get the kind of recognition that he thought he deserved. But he was actually unaware of the fact that this is actually sort of like Van Gogh, that at that time there were a number of critics and art historians who were writing very favorable things about him. And it just didn't get out there in time. And so in this sort of desperation, feeling that his career was going to go nowhere, he took his own life. It wasn't that he was really even suffering from illness. Ironically, of course, 10 years later, 1965, his work was not that well known in the United States with the exception of Duncan Phillips. But in 1965, there was the first major retrospective of de Stael in America, and it was in Boston at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And until just recent, that was the only retrospective, 65, and there hadn't been another one until just a few years ago. So he's still kind of off the grid in some ways. But when that retrospective took place in Boston, Newsweek magazine described him as, quote, the last of the great school of Paris painters. So he was very highly regarded, but that hadn't come in time. So these are the artists of the school of Paris. Artists in and around Paris: Hartung, Soulages, de Stael, Fautrier, Dubuffet. Let's look at some other countries. Let's look at Italy after the war. And here again, I'm going to show you some things that we don't have, but they're by artists that are so important. I have to at least make sure you know, at least have heard their name. But this is Mimo Rotella. We have this painting, so that's in our collection. That's called Muro Romano, Roman Wall, from 1958. It's what we call décollage on canvas. This is not in our collection. This is in the Tate. And this is called With a Smile from 1962. And it's also décollage, and I'll sort of explain what that means in a second. So what he used to do, Rotella, and again, this is in the post-war period, when you have all of these distressed surfaces, dilapidated buildings that have fallen down, buildings that have been abused, and surfaces that have been abraded, and all of these things that are very evocative of lots of different things. Remember, Leonardo even suggested that you should look at stains on walls and things. So these artists are doing all of that. But what Rotella used to do was go through Rome, and he used to rip posters off the walls that, when these things are put on, believe me, they're fixed pretty tightly. That in itself is interesting, especially in Italy, because what they'll do, and what they did, is to put posters, the same poster, 3 dozen times right next to each other. So you get this kind of collage effect. In any case, if you want to see something about that, you should see, of course, The Bicycle Thieves, the movie, where the guy gets a job putting up posters, and then they steal his bike, and then all hell breaks out, because he has to have a bike to have the job, and then once he loses his bike, that's it. So Rotella would pull off these posters. He would rip them off, and they never came off entirely. He'd just get bits and pieces, and then he'd go to the studio and paste them to his canvas. So these are all fragments of posters that he's painted. He's ripped them off, and then however they get ripped off, he then assembles them on the canvas. Of course, poster art, and especially cinematic posters, because with Cinecittà in Rome, the history of cinema in Italy is very important. So a lot of the posters they were movie posters, advertising films, and many, many, many of them were advertising American films. So the influence of GIs in America, American film, Hollywood, all of this was very important. So for example, this one is called With a Smile, and it probably relates to Cary Grant up here, because he's smiling. So this probably came from a movie poster that was advertised, in part, one of these sections came from a movie poster that was advertising a Cary Grant film. He was very popular in Italy. You get fragments of Italian words. So you get Roma, that's not a fragment. You see the word fragment of Maggio, Domenica, Sunday, all of these things. Cary Grant kind of smiles down. It's text and imagery, so it goes together. It has a certain distressed post-war fatigue, shall we say. In that sense, it owes a lot to the artist that Rotella really admired earlier, and we've talked about him as Kurt Schwitters. The collages of Kurt Schwitters were very important to Rotella. And so what décollage means is just the opposite of collage. With collage, you're pasting things on. With décollage, you're tearing things off. So once you paste things on, you can still start to tear them off. So it's kind of a reverse process. He talks about being inspired by the posters, the walls of Rome, he said this, quote, "I was literally spellbound, and even more so because at that time I was convinced that painting was finished, that something new had to be unearthed, something alive and modern. So in the evenings I began to tear the posters, ripping them from the walls. and take them back to my studio, creating compositions and leaving them exactly the way they were, exactly the way I saw them. That is how the décollage came to be. So this becomes an important, again, it's a somewhat automatic technique in many ways. So rotella is important. This is a tough rotella. I mean, if this is the only rotella you've ever seen, you're somewhat at a loss, because these are the ones that perhaps are the ones that people know. This is a pretty Spartan, shall we say, rotella. Now we have another artist. He was up once before we renovated the East Building. Now he's down again. And that's Gastone Novelli. So we have this work in our collection called La Liberazione, the Liberation, from 1959. Before the renovation, we did have him up in a little area where we had some of the post-World War II Europeans. This is not in our collection. That's in a private collection in Rome, and that's called Vocabulary from 1964. You remember I mentioned to you before that everybody has a manifesto. I mean, there are more manifestos than you can shake a stick at. No matter who you are, where you are, what country, and everybody's writing a manifesto. So we go to a cafe, we have a few drinks, let's write a manifesto. And okay, you'll be in, you'll be out, whatever. Well, you could write a different manifesto. And I mean, they're everywhere. And some of them are quite profound, you know. Others are pretty opaque, and others, you feel like maybe they had a couple of too many drinks. In any case, Novelli is part of a group of Roman abstract painters whose group was called Forma, F-O-R-M-A, Forma. And they got together as a group, and they put out a magazine in 1957 that was called The Modern Experience. And what they advocated is what you can kind of see here, better in the painting on the right than actually in ours, although you can kind of look carefully here, you have to see. There's writing. What they advocated was a kind of painting writing, you might say, kind of graffiti, you might say, using painting as a form of communication through signs, letters, hieroglyphics, encryptions, creating your own personal code, things like that, so that you made a lot of notations. See all the letters and things here? It's kind of like a CIA painting. And a lot of this came from graffiti on walls. Rome had great graffiti. Actually, it still does. So they would see people just making notations. It could be anybody, a gang, it could be just a person. And they sort of almost started to catalog these things and then pulled them into their paintings. They almost all, Novelli almost always paints them white. So it's almost like again, sort of like a tabula rasa. It's not a blackboard, it's a whiteboard. But then he makes these notations. Talking about what he was trying to accomplish, at one point he says, quote, "To paint is also to express by signs that which one cannot or does not know how to express with actions." Very often in Novelli's work, if you look at it closely and follow him chronologically, his paintings are almost like personal diaries. Because once you crack his code, and once you kind of figure out, okay, this is coming back, and this is in conjunction to that, and this always follows that, you can almost start to figure out that he's communicating in a kind of a personal way. The artist he's the closest to in America, who actually was in Rome at this time, Cy Twombly. Yeah, they kind of go together in that particular way. And certainly Twombly is tough. There's no question. Now, we have a Novelli, and we have a Rotella, so that's great. The two most, what I would consider, this is my own personal opinion, the two most important Italian painters at this period, and the post-war period, we don't have in our collection, but that doesn't stop me from talking about them, because they're that important. And the first one represented here is Alberto Burri, B-U-R-R-I. This is a work called Composition, Composizione from 1953. It's and then this work on the right is called Bianco B, white letter B, from 1965. Now, Burri serves in the Second World War. He's actually a doctor. He's a physician. And in 1943, he's captured by the British. He becomes a prisoner of war. They hand him over to the Americans, and then the Americans send him to a prisoner of war camp in all places, Texas. So he's shipped out of Europe to a POW camp in Texas to sit out the war. He really didn't have a history as an artist or a painter up to this point in time. He was a doctor, and in fact, he was a very accomplished doctor and a surgeon as well. So you're in a POW camp. I mean, okay, it's Texas. So he's got a lot of time on his hands. And so he just starts to scrounge around looking for materials that he might be able to do some art with, kind of at first I think he was just thinking about sort of therapy, just keep himself sort of occupied. The thing he could find most readily were burlap sacks, pieces of burlap, in part because a lot of the provisions that came from the Americans were in burlap sacks. And then they'd be sort of tossed and he could rip them. And then he had a scrounge, though, for other things like thread and all these other things. And then he starts his most famous and important first series is this series called, in Italian, sacchi, which means sacks, the sack series. And they're just these burlap works that have been stitched and patched with some paint. So this work is burlap, thread, synthetic polymer paint. He got really good at finding things. It has some gold leaf in it, believe it or not. And it's onto a black fabric, which in some places where there's a hole, you can see the black fabric peering through. This is 53. So actually, I mean, that's after the war. Of course, he could get other materials. The one on the right is a later picture from 65. And now he starts to really up the ante because now he starts to torch his paintings. So this is plastic acrylic combustion, that means fire, and Vinavil, which is a synthetic, like a plastic, and then another synthetic plastic that he champions, which is called Celotex. He puts all these things together. They're plastic, they're synthetic, they're highly combustible, and then he takes a blowtorch and he starts torching them. He starts to actually create out of destruction. So out of what is normally a destructive technique, setting something on fire, he's actually sort of creating with it. So he comes from the POW camp, he sits out the war. After that, he's now very serious about pursuing his career as an artist. He does not go back to the medical profession. He dedicates himself to his art. The first great series is the Sack series, as I've mentioned, and there are some really important ones that I'm not showing you that are very seminal works in modern art and certainly in the post-war European tradition. He's working with non-traditional materials. Certainly, again, these are non-traditional materials. You can think of them as assaults. I don't think they're nihilistic, but they're assaults against traditional canons of beauty, right? People, though, look at these works and they have all kinds of other connotations, and there's been a lot written about them. The stitching, because he was a doctor, suturing up wounds, things like that, because the works look like they're wounded and that sometimes blood or red comes through, that's again related to the war experience. They have an impoverished look, and Burri came from the land of St. Francis of Assisi in Umbria, in that area. And so perhaps there's a reference to all these things have been posited. They're certainly in contradiction to high art, to the different media of high art, and all of that. Now, I'm just showing you these two, but I want to let you know, well, let me give you a few quotes here that sort of explain things. Talking about materials, because people have looked at Burri's work and they think it's all highly symbolic, what I just said. St. Francis, suturing, war wounds, stitching up the wounded, all of that. And so this was always following Burri. And at one point he said, quote, when he was asked about his materials and how he chooses materials, he said, if I don't have one material, I use another. It's all the same. and then he says, I choose to use poor materials to prove that they could still be useful. The poorness of a medium is not a symbol. It's a device for painting. In other words, he's coming down on the side of formalism. I'm not really here trying to evoke pain or suffering or the war. I'm just concerned with these materials as now a formal vocabulary. Again, somebody very important to Buri is Schwitters. Kurt Schwitters is very important. If you work in any non-traditional medium, you kind of confront Schwitters at some point. Let me just tell you the other series, and you can look these up for yourself, and they're remarkable. The earliest series is the Saki, the sacks. Then he does a series called Katrami, he uses tar on burlap, but they have a lot of tar. Then he creates the Muffe series, which means molds. He puts pumice and glue together and puts it on these sort of burlap surfaces very often. There's the Gobi or Gobo series. Gobo means hunchback in Italian, and that's when he began to shape the canvas. It would bow out like a hunchback and use these various materials. The Bianchi, that's that synthetic series there. Then there's the Legni. Legno in Italian means wood, and this is where he would take thin sheets of wood and apply them to a surface and then set them on fire. Then there's the ferri. Ferro means iron in Italian, and this is almost exactly as the same, except they were thin sheets of metal that he would weld together, and then he would torch those as well. So they would get a kind of a patina, what you might call a combustion patina. And then the two most interesting series in some ways are the more modern ones. One is called the Plastiche, which are synthetic materials like this, but they're this material called Celotex, and they get really thick, and these plastics come in very bright colors. And when he torches those, so then he torches them, they open up and they create what look like craters, and like you can almost look into the picture. They're remarkable. And then the last series is the Creti. Creti means sort of crack or crackle. And here's where he takes, he creates this paste, and he experiments with different synthetic materials. And then he lays a support on a couple of sawhorses, sort of flat or on a table. And then he trowels all this stuff on. Then he does nothing. And what starts to happen are these things start to crackle apart, like, a dry riverbed. He does nothing. He just times it. It may take 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and these things just crackle. They're monochromatic, and they're really quite stunning. So Buri's important. Buri almost always goes hand in hand with another guy in Italy that is not in our collection, and that's Lucio Fontana. So this is Fontana's work. Spatial, on the left is called Spatial Concept Expectation from 1951, and on the right is Spatial Concept, same title, Expectation, but in 1963. Painting on the left is in the Guggenheim. The one on the right is at the Hirshhorn. You can see his work at the Hirshhorn. They have a nice selection. He's Argentinian, but he has an Italian father, and he really grows up between Argentina and Italy, between Buenos Aires and Milan. He goes to the Brera in Milan. He writes another great manifesto that is really dense. It's called the White Manifesto, that's the title of it, which is published in 1946. And he coins this term spatialism, that he's looking for a new type of art in this post-war age, something that would relate to in bringing into a painting a real spatial presence, not an illusion of space like perspective, but an actual spatial presence, and that would link up almost. He gets to be very cosmological, And in fact, he becomes instrumental in developing a whole set of ideas about art that are installation oriented around art. Aside from these paintings, he may be more important today as an artist who created light installations. Some very, very famous ones, and he affected a whole generation of artists in that regard. But these are the breakthrough, the sort of the works that brought him to attention. So the series here are buchi. Buco is hole in Italian. So he would take a punch and make holes. There's a little triangular bit, sort of. This is the tagli series. Taglio means slash or slice. And here he would take an X-Acto knife and cut through these monochromatic surfaces. Here he is. Here he is at work. I like it also because he's always like dressed up. He's got his tie on and everything. It's like, okay, it's time to go work in my studio. He takes a knife, done for the day. Let's go have a drink. Now these are very interesting, but you have to kind of get into this sort of philosophical side of things. Much like with Burri, who's torching things, Fontana is taking a negative nihilistic gesture, punching, slashing, cutting, but he's creating art out of it. It's a monochromatic field. It's a meditative thing for him. In other words, he doesn't just go up there and start slashing. Each stroke is strategic, how he thinks about it. He places behind once you puncture the surface here, he places a black gauze behind the painting so that as it peels open a bit, you have this void, this kind of sense of darkness and sort of space that's kind of off into the cosmos. Again, he repudiates illusionary space, that idea of painting. So this is, in some ways, again, he's like Pollock. Very often what I do is I put something like this up against Pollock approaching the easel, where Pollock has to decide, or even de Kooning, where's that first? Remember we talked about mural, and Pollock's looking at that big white thing, and he's kind of figure, okay, it's the same thing with Fontana, but it's a very different kind of, but it has the same idea of the first mark is very important. And as he would say repeatedly, I throw a lot of this stuff out. He'll try and then, oh, no, that's just, that doesn't have the right feeling. Now, this is interesting because you have these artists now who, in post-war Europe, are cutting, slicing, puncturing the surface. It's an aggression to the surface. Even if it has a positive, they're torching it, even if it has a positive implication. And a lot of this does relate to a post-war sensibility, obviously, either trying to surmount it. In the case of Fontana, he's positive, actually. He wants to go into some place that's going to never have the kinds of conflagration that we've had. Burri comes out of the war, et cetera. So let's go to Spain. This is a painting on the left that we have at the National Gallery. It's not up. It's by Manolo Millares. It's called Quadro number 78, picture number 78, but it was painted in 1959. And what Millares, where he comes from, of course, is Spain. And of course, he's coming through Spain, not so much about Spain in the Second World War, because essentially Spain was neutral, but Franco and fascism. So you see a number of Spanish artists who live under Franco, and Franco rules a hell of a long time, who speak to that kind of oppression. So what he begins to do is to, again, abrade, puncture, rip, tear, use materials that are kind of not particularly thought of as appropriate for art. And this is, again, he's very much a part of art informal. There's a lot of abstraction, there's a lot of gesture, there's a lot of process. Not all of this goes the way he thinks it's going to go. So he brings together a lot of things. Some of these paintings are gestural, they're calligraphic, they're material, they're certainly matter. You can sense the physicality here of the act that it takes to create. Of course, He's part of a group that writes a manifesto, and his group is called El Paso, the Steppe, El Paso. They get together in the same time that Novelli is getting together with the Forma people in Italy, and this group is called El Paso. Maybe the name that's more familiar to you is Antonio Saura. He's part of this group, but Milares is also part of the group. And they're about this kind of, again, material work tied to the sort of the reality of life. And certainly they're dealing with what they called at this time and what was called at this time Black Spain. Black Spain was a metaphor for living under Franco. These were black times. And so what you very often have with these artists is this idea that you have to destroy something in order to rebuild it. So this sense of destruction here and annihilation of painting is ultimately supposed to lead to the regeneration of painting. Now, Franco, remember, is in power from 1939 to 1975. That's a heck of a long time. Now, what I'm showing against the Milares is a painting I hope you recognize when we did our beautiful Miro show. This is Joan Miro. We had this in our show. In fact, we had it suspended from the ceiling so you could look right through it. That's the way actually you were supposed to see it. We had several of these. They were hanging from the ceiling so you could look right through and they would just move in the air, almost like a mobile. So this is Miro's painting called Burnt Canvas Number 4. It's from 1973. It's very late in Miro's career. This is a strict anti-fascist, anti-Franco. Miro came out of this period, and of course his great early work was all about the grief of the Spanish, the Spanish Republic, the Spanish Civil War, and he just continues his antipathy to Franco even into the 70s. We don't think of Miro that way. We sort of, he's always seemed so jolly and so nice and so, so cuddly, but he had a real strong, pronounced sense of Spain. That's why The Farm, the painting we have, is so important to Miro, because it represents everything he loves about Spain and Catalonia. So he finally does the same thing. He's just torching paintings here that are statements about the plight of Spain under Franco. Remember, when you think about Miro being so cuddly, you have to remember that early in his career he said, quote, "I want to assassinate painting." So again, and then he said about the Cubists, "I'll break their guitars." So he had that kind of sensibility. England. So what are the English doing in the post-war period or right up to the war? This is Francis Bacon. We do have a Bacon, one Bacon. I'm not going to show it to you. It's a dog that's kind of running along a track. It's very dark. You can look it up online. This is the great Bacon that's at the Tate in London. 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion from 1944. Bacon is exempted from having to serve in the military, and again, in fact, for health reasons. He too had asthma. He spends much of his time during the war painting out in Hampshire, comes back to London. He meets, of course, Lucian Freud, the great English painter, and also Graham Sutherland. This painting here in this period, 1944, the works that come out of this period is where Bacon himself says, this is where I really started to paint. This is where I started to consider myself an artist with the creation of this work. It's a triptych. It refers, of course, to the figures mourning at the cross of the crucifixion. But of course, it's a torturous, excruciating, hellish kind of scream of pain and suffering. He mentioned that it was less about religion even than it was about Greek tragedy, Greek myth, the Eumenides. He mentions these the vengeful furies that we find in Greek mythology. He drew on a lot of sources for this painting, and one of the things that people always refer to is the fact that when this painting was being worked on, and then when it was pretty well close to completion, the very first photographs, this started like in April 44, 45, well, not 44, 45. He exhibited this, in April 45. But at that time, the very first photographs and footage came out of the concentration camps. This is when they had been liberated, and now you were getting footage of the concentration camps. And he was starting to see that. Of course, this painting owes a lot to Picasso, to Guernica from 1937. It is a pessimistic painting that certainly does relate to the Holocaust, the concentration camps, to nuclear war, to all the things that Bacon was fretting about, as many painters were. Here's some detail. The fact that it's a triptych immediately has a religious connotation, a three-paneled work. You think of an altarpiece, but this is, again, a very different kind of altarpiece. This is just incredible, this distended. Yeah. Again, I've just selected, there are many, many talented English painters, Graham Sutherland and others, but I'm trying to stick with those who seem to relate directly and most especially to the New York painters. So that's Alan Davey. Alan Davey is represented here. On the left, Entrance to a Paradise from 1949. That's at the Tate. And then Birth of Venus on the right from 1955, also at the Tate. Davey is probably, he just passed away, I think it was in 2014. Davey is probably the closest English painter who would be similar to an American abstract expressionist. Sometimes you look at a Davey, you think it's a Pollock or somebody, or a de Kooning. He is the closest thing in Europe to an American abstract expressionist. He didn't like that kind of connotation because he thought his sources came from other places. And at one point he said, I think my work was more related to Paul Klee and Arp than to that of American abstract expressionists like Pollock. Paul Klee and Arp had a poetic feeling and a childlike magic, which was closest to my own feelings. So he sort of distanced himself from that connection to the Americans. But we know when he went on everybody goes on their European tour, he got a scholarship in 1948. He didn't go to Paris, he went to Venice. And when he went to Venice, that was right at the 1948 Biennale. And a big presence in the American pavilion at that 48 Biennale was Peggy Guggenheim, and she had the works of Jackson Pollock there. So he saw Pollock's work at the Venice Biennale, for sure. But again, he likes to speak to his own unique kind of quality, which is totally valid. He is, just like the Americans, he is interested in surrealism, automatism, the idea of abstraction, of kind of working in a quick, rapid, kind of well thought out manner, letting the process take over. He does create images and glyphic notations, much like Gottlieb and people, the way he segments things sometimes. He's one of England's great abstract painters. Again, somebody who's not that well known in the States. I don't think we may have some prints by Davey. Germany. So remember now, we're in the period after the great expressionist period of like Max Beckmann and Otto Dix and all those people, but we're before the young generation of Gerhard Richter and Anselm Kiefer and Sigmund Polke, right? So we're in these guys grow up in the war. Either they're young, they don't serve in the war, they may be too young. Some of them are older and they stay in Germany. Some of them are sort of persecuted by the Nazis, but they're the artists who have stayed in Germany now and have to kind of deal with what is going on in Germany after the war. That's a whole different kettle of fish than England or France after the war. And the pivotal German painter in this period, and one of the great German painters ever, is a guy named K.O. Gotz, G-O-T-Z, Karl Otto Gotz, who dies in 2017 at the age of 103. This is Gotz when he was a youngster, because this is 2011. So he lived another 6 years. He's with the curator from the Harvard Art Museums because they did a very important show on German art in this period. It's called Inventur, Art in Germany from 1943 to 1955. And that was in 2018, they did the show at Harvard. So this is the curator who had been working on this show for like 5 or 6 years. So she had, in 2011, she had met Götz here. After he died, I'm sorry, not after he died, on the occasion of his 100th birthday, which was 2013, 2014, the Staatliche Museum, the National Gallery in Berlin, did a massive retrospective. That's this. There's his name here. The director of the National Gallery in Berlin said this at the time. K.O. Götz will be remembered as one of the most important German artists of the 20th century, and I think that's true. He was born in Aachen in 1914, and he is a gesture painter. He is, again, somewhat comparable in Germany to what we would have in the United States. He's important as a teacher. He taught in Dusseldorf at the Kunstakademie, and here's the interesting thing. His two most famous students are Sigmar Polke and Gerhard Richter. That's the young generation, right? So he's right in the middle, and that's a very important period in time. Now, a lot of these artists from this period in Germany are unknown in America because we wanted nothing to do with Germany at this time. We were not going to go out and collect the art of these artists for American collections. It was just not going to happen. There was so much anti-German sentiment in America after the war that the idea that, gee, I'd like to start building up our German collection, that wasn't going to happen. And in fact, that relates to what we have here. So, for example, I have a quote here from the in 1950, the director of the Art Institute of Chicago suggested that were his museum to show an exhibition of contemporary German work, it would, quote, would run against great objections. He would not even try in 1950 to mount a show of German art from that period. Now, what's fascinating about this in a historic sense is that Germany in the post-war period, if you're a historian, my God, I could fill this room with books and analyses of Germany in the post-war period. Nothing like that exists in art history. Nothing like that. This is almost a terra incognito. So the show at Harvard and a few other things, the Busch Reisinger Museum at Harvard has a collection that has some Götz works. It was just not going to be happening in the States. This is Götz's Untitled from 1952 on the left. This is in the Harvard collection. And this is his painting on the right called June 1954, number 2 from 1954, also at Harvard. He is maybe the most important German art informal painter, again, the sort of a German equivalent to American abstract expressionists. These artists of this generation, of his generation, got caught right in between, as I said. In many cases, there was still a lingering sentiment about modern art from the Nazis. In other words, these guys still suffered very often because even though the war was over, the Nazis were gone, etc., they had a huge impact on German thinking about art and culture that still was lingering. So they didn't have that easy a time of it. There was still a kind of hostility on the part of the public for a lot of these artists because of Nazi cultural policies that they had been inculcated with. In America, of course, it's the issue that I just mentioned. It was now all about war crimes, the Holocaust, all this prejudice against these artists because of the time period that they represented. Götz, though, is a great painter. He's a really important painter and should be better known in the States. Now, having said that, there are a few other artists like this in Germany that I would be surprised if you've heard of. One is Louise Rosler. That's spelled R-O-S-L-E-R. This is a painting collage with watercolor called Frankfurt in Rubble from 1947-48. And this is a collage on the right by Rosler called The Room from 1951. The women artists of this period in Germany are interesting because they seem to be the first to begin to think about the future. Okay, it was bad. And all of the stuff that happened was horrible. But now we have to try to go on. We have to try to continue. We have to try to create something new, something better. So there's a sense among the women artists, and Louise Rossler's in this case, that we shouldn't just be all about the grief and the pain and all of that. So you can sense right here with the palette and everything. I mean, this is not a particularly oppressive, depressing work. It deals with Frankfurt and the rubble, but it has beautiful color. It has almost a certain sort of humor. She's a great collage artist, without a doubt. And she talks about getting discarded materials, especially things that American GIs threw on the ground, specifically candy wrappers. An American GI would eat a piece of candy, you throw the thing on the ground, and she and her daughter would go out and scrounge for all these wrappers and things that then they would use. So she has a certain optimism about recovery. And at one point, another artist who was of her generation said in 51, and this kind of says what I'm getting at, quote, "We don't want any more destruction. Our view of life is a hopeful one." So a lot of these artists wanted to transcend. Here's Louise Rossler's collage called Street from 1951. These are beautiful, large, colorful. Some are small, this is a larger one. Here, this has printed paper, metal foil, candy wrappers, cellophane, wax paper with opaque watercolor, oil paint on woven paper. She and her daughter were arrested. After the war, first of all, her husband disappeared in the war and she never found him. So it was just Louise with her daughter. And they were evacuated to Berlin and resettled then in the town of Königstein near Frankfurt. And that's when she started to turn her attentions towards art. And again, she's, I think, somebody who should be much better known, let's just put it that way, in this generation of Germans. This is a work that Harvard owns. Now, I just want to mention this slow regeneration of Germany and how things then start to point towards a more optimistic future. And an iconic painting in German art history of this time is this painting. This is by Konrad Klopek, called Typewriter, 1955. Now, I've gone ahead and shown it against Klaus Oldenburg's Soft Typewriter from 1963. Because what you start to see in Germany is German artists slowly begin to believe that things are going to be better, things have to change, where they're more hopeful, and that today, fundamentally, is a new period, different than anything that's come in the past. And so we have to sort of embrace that. So there's a certain kind of optimism. This is the first painting by Klopek that is part of the series called The Machines, in which he would paint like adding machines, typewriters, faucets, plumbing. I mean, there are all these mechanical things that he would paint in this incredibly realistic kind of precise fashion. This was painted as a still life exercise in 1955. He was 20 years old, and he just wanted to sort of see if he could just do a still life that was just a real, pure, kind of closely observed exercise. And of course, what he was against, as you would sense, was all that gestural art informal stuff that we just saw with Goetz. That's, okay, I don't know, I'm gonna go somewhere else. And so that's when he began to produce this great series. In essence, this is 1955. This is in some ways pointing towards pop art. It's pointing towards, we see Oldenburg here, it's pointing towards portraying these commercially produced kind of cold, direct objects with no sort of symbolic idea. And he's certainly against, just like the pop artists wanted very little to do with the New York School. We talked about Rauschenberg, I gotta find another bar. It's the same here, Klopek is saying, we're gonna go in a different direction. So this is a very important painting in German art history in the 20th century. it really does kind of point in a different direction. We haven't talked about the Low Countries, so let's talk about the Low Countries. The most important group of artists that come out of Denmark, Belgium, and Holland are the artists that we call Cobra, the Cobra artists. This is a group photograph here from an exhibition in Copenhagen in 1948. Maybe the name most known in the United States, although all these guys are important, but the most famous name probably that we know in the United States is Karel Appel, this guy. And this is Karel Appel here. This term cobra, C-O-B-R-A, came about not in reference to the snake, but it came in reference to the three cities where the artists came from that were the founding cities. C-O for Copenhagen, B-R for Brussels, and A for Amsterdam. And that gave us the term cobra. It was again much like surrealism in the sense that it has many poets and writers as it did painters and artists. The leading figure on the literary side was a man named Christian d'Outremont, who was one of the founders of the group. Of course, they had to have a manifesto. So they were sitting in a bar in Paris, and they came up with a manifesto that's called The Case Was Heard. The Case Was Heard. And they started to sort of draw up their theories, among which you had this kind of statement, that what they were in favor of, the founding principles, was, quote, creation before theory. And they're writing a manifesto, right? Usually you write a manifesto because you're theoretical. Creation before theory, that art must have roots, materialism which begins with the material, the mark as a sign of well-being, spontaneity, experimentation. It was the simultaneity of these elements which created Cobra. So it's going to be a real aggressive, sort of spontaneous, not theoretical. It's not going to be Mondrian, and of course who's Dutch. It's against all of that kind of stuff. So all of these, I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but the artist best known from Copenhagen, from Denmark, was Oscar Jorn. He's maybe the one you know the best. Belgium is Pierre Alechinsky. He's maybe the one we know the best today in the States. And then from the Netherlands, it would be two guys who went just by their kind of first names, Constant and Corneille, those two. But the more important one is Karel Appel, and that's who I'm going to sort of talk about. But this group, they write their manifesto, and then they're going to have their first exhibition. It's going to be at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 1949. So here's everybody coming with their paintings to come and have the exhibition. There's Karel Appel over there, coming to have their exhibition, and all hell breaks out. So here you see the headlines, because it created something of a riot. The public was not ready for any of this in Amsterdam. It was a very conservative public. They were still back in neoclassicism. And the thing that really got under people's skin is that this group seemed to have a leftist kind of lean, that they didn't like that. And d'Outremont, who was the poet who wrote the manifesto, he had written an article called The Big Natural Convergence. And so when they were outside here, he started to read his article. Now he's French, so he was reading in French, which nobody understood because they were in Holland, but they thought he was reading in Russian. So they thought he was a communist, and why do we have to hear this guy spouting Russian when in fact he was reading French? So there was something of a riot. People prevented them from putting their work up. There was all kinds of pushing and shoving, and that's what you see covered in the press here. These are all the headlines. Among the great headlines were one newspaper, the headline was Trotskyite riot in Stedelijk Museum. Another one headline, brawl in museum in Amsterdam. And another headline, communist riot ends in a fist fight. So they made quite a splash. Now this is Appel, who is great. He is so gutsy. Remember I mentioned Maurice Vlaminck and I said he was a gut painter? Maurice Vlaminck looks like a dilettante compared to Karel Appel. This is Earthbird from 1955. That's a detail. So this is a detail of this section right here. Okay. He starts painting at the age of 14. He studies at the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam. He buys in directly to this idea that painting should be direct, expressive sort of action in that sense, with strong color. What's fascinating about him in many ways, I often, when I test students and things, I often put an Appel against Mondrian, because they're both Dutch and they both use the primary colors repeatedly. But there's a whole different approach to things here. He's very influenced by Dubuffet and Art Brut. And he really wants to create a raw, untutored, unsophisticated kind of a way of approaching painting. Again, he's interested in children's art and all of those things that we've talked about. There's a lot of footage that you can look up on YouTube of Karel Appel painting in his studio. It's incredible. I mean, he looks like he's ready to kill somebody. I mean, he just goes at that canvas, and it's just amazing. He talks about how he would work, for example, and he says, quote, "Let's suppose that the first color I apply to the canvas is red. Now that action determines everything else that happens to the painting. After that, I could put yellow on it or some blue." Notice the primaries. "Then I might perhaps obliterate the red with black, and the blue would perhaps become yellow, and the yellow purple, while the black changes to white. Obviously, anything can happen, but the whole fascinating process began with that first red. And if I hadn't begun with red, the whole painting would have been different. Is there a system? Is there order in this chaos?" That's a question he leaves us to ponder. Here, another example. This is called In the Storm from 1960. And again, a lot of these artists are still dealing with the post-war trauma, now we're into the nuclear age and everything. So Appel says at one point, quote, "We live always in a tremendous chaos, and who can make the chaos positive anymore? Only the artist." So this is a detail, by the way, of this section right here. So that's a detail here. He is concerned with society, with politics. I mean, he has those aspects to it, but he wants to address those things through purely formal. He doesn't give us paintings of, poor people or politicians or anything like that. And his canvases are almost ravaged. He uses a palette knife, the brush, the stick, the trowel, uses his fingers. At a certain point, he just goes in and starts using his hands. It's kind of, again, this idea that I mentioned, pre-war, post-war, that maybe we have to in order to build something new, we have to destroy the old. We have to sort of get rid of the old in order to have something new. Now, we don't have any Appels. We have some prints, we don't have any paintings. But the other artist, just to mention, is Pierre Alechinsky, he's one of the Belgians from Brussels. We do have these two works, which are acrylic on paper, and so similar to Appel, but nowhere near as violent. This is called Ecological Seminar. This idea, again, of ecology, archaeology, of sort of investigating things, and then this is called Glassware, Allegorical Glassware, there on the right. This is from 1972 and 1981, so they're much later than the Cobra period. Now, the last thing I want to talk about I want to come back to Karel Appel in just one way, and that's opera. If you know and you like opera, there was a production at the Salzburg Festival in 2006, and it was The Magic Flute by Mozart. This is the poster designed by Karel Appel. And this had actually been done at the National Opera of the Netherlands in 1995. Appel had first done it there. And then it was brought back to Salzburg in 2006. 2006 was the 250th anniversary of Mozart's birth, and Salzburg was celebrating that by putting on all 22 of his operas. And all 22 of those operas were actually then filmed for DVD, And if you go, they were filmed by Decca, and they were produced in a series called Mozart 22, so you can find those today. I have the one of the Magic Flute. The director was Pierre Audi, and he asked Carol Appel to do the sets. And another great designer did the costumes, Jorge Yara, who's Chilean. So Appel had first done the opera in the Netherlands in '95. That's what this poster refers to. And these are actually from the early Netherlandish production. And there he is, working on some of the sets. But then they brought it back to Salzburg, and that's what I want to show you here. I love this production. I mean, a lot's been written about it in a lot of different ways. Some people grind the axes about certain things. When it came to Salzburg in 2006, Appel had just died. He had died in May of 2006. So he didn't see the production here, but it was based on what he had done in the Netherlands. So here is Papageno here, and he creates this whole car. Papageno comes in riding a car, and these creatures and things. It is literally a Carel Appel painting that just jumps out and kind of attacks you. Here's Papageno with Pamina, and here's Tamino. He creates these are all paper mache characters. He looked at a lot of different things, Art Brut, African art. He was thinking about a lot of sources here. But the thing that is most remarkable are the colors. This production just bathes you in color. He didn't do the costumes, but the costumes are great. This is the Queen of the Night, who is the great American singer, Diana Damrau. In my estimation, she's the definitive Queen of the Night living today. And here she is with Pamina. But notice the sets. This is all Carel Appel. This is Monostatos, kind of the evil guy in the opera. These were posters for the Netherlandish production. This is the flowers on stage are gigantic. So like some of them wouldn't fit up on this stage. And they're all paper mache and painted. There's an elephant at one point. Here. My feeling is if you're trying to introduce opera to a child, this might be the DVD you want to buy and show it to a child. He is so associated, a lot of modern artists are associated with opera, David Hockney and others. But in Amsterdam, there's a Cobra museum. There's a museum devoted to the Cobra artists in Amsterdam. And they did a show on Carel Appel and the opera. So this is the scrim that was part of the Magic Flute. Some of these were in the Magic Flute, some of these are in other productions. This show was in 2016, which is when, just before, again, he dies in May of 2006. And then in 2016, they did the show to honor him at the Cobra Museum. So his art has whole nother aspect to it in that particular sense. That's it. Thanks, everybody.